Welcome to the Herald Democrat Sports Podcast. I'm the sports editor of the Herald Democrat, Jason De La Rosa, and you're listening to the Herald Democrat Sports Podcast. We are closing in on the final weeks of the season. We are about to hit double digits. This is Week 10 coming up. We're going to talk about all the playoff permutations, who's in, who's out, who needs help. Lots of things going on as we look back at what happened over the weekend in Week 9 and what it means for the games that are coming up this Friday in Week 10. For some teams, or at least one team, this is their last week of the season because they have the bye next week. We have all sorts of stuff to talk about, and we'll get underway right now as we do what we normally do. We'll run down the games from the biggest districts down to the smallest, and we will start, of course, with the Sherman Bearcats in District 7-5A Division 1. As they travel, they make another long trip out to East Texas and take on Tyler, formerly John Tyler with a name change, now just Tyler. Sherman is 3-5 and 1-3 overall. 3-5 overall and 1-3 in district play, and Tyler is 5-3 and 3-1 in district play. Both teams are coming off losses. Sherman lost last week 50-28 against McKinney North, while Tyler lost 42-14 against Highland Park. This is a big game for both teams. We mentioned obviously last week was a big game for Sherman as well. They came up short, and they are in a little bit of trouble now to make the playoffs. They do not control their own destiny. They need to win, not just this week, but also in their finale against West Mesquite. But before we get to that, they have to take care of business against Tyler. And not only do they have to win against Tyler, but they have to win by at least 17 points to max out the number of points between a potential three-way tie between themselves, North, and Tyler. Or if McKinney North is able to beat Longview, then Sherman would have the head-to-head on Tyler, and it would not matter what the margin was against Tyler. That would just be, as long as you win, you're in. So there is that. But so there's two things that are at play in terms of this district, and Tyler is currently tied for second place with Longview. They can clinch a playoff spot with a win, and Sherman would be officially eliminated with a loss. They would not be able to catch McKinney North because of the head-to-head tiebreaker situation from last week. That would be the difference. If Sherman had won that game, they would be ahead of McKinney North by the slimmest of margins, and McKinney North is done next week. And if they lose to Longview, they'll be at 3-3. So, like we mentioned, obviously the key game last week for Sherman, it was relatively close in the early stages before North put together a big third quarter to break things open a little bit. So it was 14-8 after the first quarter, 21-15 at halftime, and that's relatively, that's a game between two teams fighting for a playoff spot that you would think. And then McKinney North scored twice to open the third quarter. Sherman was able to get on the board, but then McKinney scored once more in the quarter to open things back up. So tough loss for Sherman. It was a very big contrast in styles. Sherman did their damage through the air. Phoenix Grant had 331 yards passing and 4 touchdowns. Vontrell Sanders led the way. He had 4 catches for 121 yards and 2 scores. Aries Jones had 6 catches for 109 yards and a score. And Elijah Chapman just missed the 100-yard mark. He had 7 catches for 99 yards and a touchdown as well. And McKinney North, they got the job done on the ground. They had 314 yards on the ground. Jaden Smith led them with 167 yards and 2 touchdowns in the second half as McKinney North kind of grinded away the game there. And so now Sherman's in a tough spot. You gotta win, and you gotta win this week before you can even worry about next week. And like we said, there's a chance that you may have to win by a certain amount. Sherman is no stranger to that in this district. We have seen a lot of games go down to the end, where teams in the last week of this district either need to win to force ties or win by certain margins or they're left out. Sherman has been in that spot before, when they have been left out because they won, but they did not win by enough to have the advantage on point differential. And so Sherman could end up being in the spot. Now Tyler does finish with Longview, and Sherman finishes with West Mesquite, so you would have to like Sherman's chances for them to tie Tyler if they both if Sherman wins out and Tyler loses out. That's obvious. That could be a distinct possibility. Sherman gets the win on Friday, and then you're looking at getting potentially the 4th seed for the playoffs. And so that's where you are if you're a Bearcat fan. You're rooting for. Honestly, you're probably rooting for McKinney North to beat Longview. And you're rooting for the Bearcats to come away with a victory, and not just a victory, but a pretty resounding one. So that way they have taken care of whatever point differential that there might be with that situation. So it's a little murky. We may know obviously a lot by Friday night, but we may be in a situation where it goes into next week, and we have to wait to see what happens between Tyler and Longview and Sherman and West Mesquite. McKinney North will be done, so we'll know what their situation is, and then we'll see if there's an 11th game in the offering for the Bearcats. But they've got to take care of business when they go to Tyler on Friday night. Otherwise, they will be eliminated. So we'll see what happens after another long another long road trip for the Bearcats out to East Texas. Moving over to Denison. Denison Frisco Liberty, big matchup in District 7-5A Division 2. This is probably the big matchup in that district compared to some other stuff going on. Obviously, they both are coming off wins. From last week, we talked about Denison playing the last place team in the standings, Frisco Lebanon Trail. They won 48-24, so they are 6-2 overall and 4-2 in district play. And Frisco Liberty took on a team that's not too far from the bottom, only a game out of last place, I guess second to last place because of the odd number of games. They beat Princeton 53-28, so they are 7-1 overall and 5-1 in district play. This game is at Toyota Stadium. Denison, obviously, this is their 3rd trip to Frisco this year. The first 2 were at Kuykendall Stadium. This is going to be over at Toyota Stadium at 7 o'clock. As always, remember that because that district has 7 o'clock kickoffs. And this is very straightforward. The winner is going to clinch a playoff spot. That is guaranteed no matter who wins. The loser will clinch a playoff spot as long as Rock Hill loses to Frisco, which is a pretty good assumption. And that is a Thursday game, so those two teams will know going in whether they're going to make the playoffs regardless of what happens in the game against each other, because the loser is going to end up in a tie, could end up in a tie potentially with Rock Hill, and they have both won against Rock Hill, so that is not an issue. What is an issue is playoff seeding, but like we've talked all along in this district, the 4 teams that are going to make the playoffs are probably the 4 teams that everybody projected, and if Denison beats Frisco Liberty, I think they will fall in the order that people think they were going to fall in. So what is at stake in this game is the 3rd seed for the playoffs. The winner is probably going to get it. Frisco would have to lose one more game or potentially 2 more games, which I don't think is going to happen. Liberty ends with Lovejoy. So as long as Denison is able to take care of business this week and then take care of business next week against Princeton, they should be locked into that 3rd seed. And if Liberty wins this week, they would be guaranteed no worse than the 3 seed because Denison would have its 3rd loss, and they would be locked into the 4 seed. They would have the tiebreaker they would have the tiebreaker no matter what. So regardless of what happens against Princeton. So like I said, it's set up for if Denison were to win, they would both be 5-2 in the standings, and then Denison plays Princeton, who has going into this week is 2-5, and Liberty would have to play Lovejoy, who was undefeated, ranked number 2 in the state this week. They moved up from number 3 to number 2. So that's where you wouldn't really, even if Denison were to win, you would think that Liberty's going to lose to Lovejoy. So even if Denison did slip up, they would potentially they would still have the tiebreaker for the third seed. So third is basically at stake. That's where Denison was last year going into the playoffs. They would have potentially a better record. They could finish 8-2. And so that's kind of where they would be looking at. We talked about coming off the loss to Frisco. They have a chance with these 3 games here at the end to build that momentum. That's what they've been talking about. And this is going to be, I think, a high-powered sort of game. Frisco Liberty puts up a ton of points. They have a very, very good dual threat quarterback in Keldrick Luster. He did not play against Denison last year. He was hurt. That was the game after Thanksgiving, for those who remember the pushed-back COVID year. And that was a game that was at Denison in the afternoon. So, and that was still a 55-31 game. So, Liberty's very explosive. I think Denison can obviously put up points on them. But this has shootout potential. Or maybe there's like a 10-minute stretch where somebody makes some defensive stops to build up enough of a gap to kind of hold things off. So that there's definitely that potential in this game. And Denison, like I said, they bounced back well from that loss to Frisco by beating Lebanon Trail last week. They jumped right to the lead. They were up 27-3 at halftime. They were up 41-10 after 3 quarters. And it was pretty much nothing was in doubt in this game for sure. Probably after the first quarter. Just to kind of run down how they did that, Jadarian Price had 11 carries for 94 yards and 3 touchdowns. Caleb Hevner was 13 of 17 passing for a career best 217 yards. He threw 2 touchdown passes. One was to Dylan DeHorney and one was to Trey Rhodes. He also ran for a score. Jack Allman had a 70-yard kickoff return, and the defense played well. Held Lebanon Trail under 250 yards, and they tacked on a couple of fourth quarter touchdowns when the game was kind of out of hand. So that was kind of how things went in this game. I kind of looked at it as this could have been sort of that trap game. You're coming off a loss to a team that's was undefeated. You had big ideas of beating them to get the second seed potentially. And then you have this big showdown with Liberty coming, and right in between is the team in last place, has only won 1 game, and that came in the season opener, so they've gone almost 2 months without winning. It could have been a little dicey, but Denison came out and did what they needed to do to set up the showdown, and we'll see what happens. I think it's going to be a really fun game. And there's I don't want to say there's a lot at stake. Obviously, you don't want to face a district champion. In this case, it's probably going to be Ennis. Out of that district, so you want to get as good a seed as possible, and like we said, they'll know after how things shake out on Thursday if either of them have a chance at the top seed in the district. Since Frisco has the head-to-head tiebreaker over both of them, they really need Frisco to lose out, and I just don't see that happening. Rock Hill is feisty, so there is always that potential. But they would have to lose to Rock Hill, and then they would have to lose against Frisco Memorial in the last game of the season. And that's, again, those are, maybe you could lose one of those, but I don't think they're going to lose both. And all they have to do is win one to essentially clinch at least the second seed, pending the outcome of Denison and Liberty. So we'll see what happens. Should be a fun one. I'll be down there at Toyota Stadium 7 o'clock on Friday night. And we'll see if Denison can lock up not only a playoff spot, but also potentially the third seed for the playoffs as well. Moving down to District 4, 4A, Division 2, Van Alstyne will be hosting Sanger. And talking about playoff seeding, this is a key game for playoff seeding, as Van Alstyne is 6-2 and 1-1, and Sanger is 5-3 and 1-1. Van Alstyne is coming off a 41-12 loss against first place Salina, and Sanger is coming off a 24-20 victory against Crum. And this is a huge game in terms of seeding, because you have Van Alstyne, Sanger, and Aubrey are all tied in the standings, 1-1. Crum is 0-3. Salina is 3-0. They have essentially locked up the top seed. They do not play this week. They will officially lock up the top seed as long as Van Alstyne beats Sanger. They still have to play Sanger, so hypothetically there could be a three-way. There could be a tie there, but I think Salina, one, I don't think is worried, but I think they're basically in line to get the top seed. But Sanger, Aubrey, and Crum are all tied, and Van Alstyne plays Aubrey next week. So if Van Alstyne takes care of business both this week and next, they have a chance to get the second seed. Aubrey plays Crum this week, so I think it's pretty safe to say that Aubrey's going to be 2-1 after this game, and the winner of this game is going to be 2-1 after this game. Aubrey has already beaten Sanger, so Aubrey would go into the final week having the advantage over Sanger if there was a tiebreaker needed. And so this is a chance for Van Alstyne, who made the playoffs last year, but was the 4 seed, to move up at least a spot. If they win this game, they're essentially guaranteed the 3rd seed, pending the outcome of their game against Aubrey. So that's a big game, and you've got a team that, last week, I know the final score, does not look respective of the game. It's 41-12. You're playing a team that's ranked in the top 5 in the state at their place. And Salina did have an 18-0 lead after the first quarter, but they did tack on 2 touchdowns in the fourth quarter. So it was only a 2-score game after 3 quarters. So that's saying something. We've said Van Alstyne's improved all year. Offensively, they did struggle. A lot of people struggled against Salina. Their only loss is to Argyle, and that's understandable considering how good Argyle is. So Gavin Montgomery only threw for 97 yards, ran for 32, did have a touchdown run, and he had a 64-yard touchdown pass to Jackson Allen, who had 2 catches for 73 yards. But not a lot of offense. They did have 3 turnovers, and Salina kind of controlled things with their ground game. But like I said, that's a pretty decent showing if you can go into the fourth quarter against a top 5 team in the state, and you're looking up at the scoreboard and you see 27-12. That's not insurmountable. That's pretty good, all things considered. And so I think this is going to be an interesting game, just because last year Sanger won 42-7. They beat Crum. They barely beat Crum, and that was basically a must-win for Sanger if they wanted to, make the playoffs. Everybody in this district, has clinched a playoff spot. I'm sorry, no, they have. Excuse me. Van Alstyne and Salina have. As long as Aubrey beats Crum, that will lock in the top 4. Crum will be the team that's left out again, and then, like I said, it just comes down to seeding. So it's a pretty key game for Van Alstyne, and then of course, depending on how things go, that'll set up the scenario for the last week in terms of what they would need to happen. If they take care of business against Aubrey, then they would probably get a better seed than 4th. But Van Alstyne was in last week, even though they got beat. So now the question is, these last 2 games, can they find a better seed than the 4th place that they were last year? So they've got the home field advantage. They're obviously better than they were last year. Like we said a couple weeks ago, they're at 6 wins. Last year they only won 3. And Sanger struggled against a Crum team that Van Alstyne handled pretty well when they played. So I think Van Alstyne's probably the slight favorite, and we'll see what happens when they host Sanger in 4A Division II action on Friday night. Moving down to the 3A ranks, we have in District 4 3A Division 1, Whitesboro is hosting Paradise. There's a lot, like I said, I mean, we're at this time of year. There's a lot of key games, and this is a pretty key game in this district. The top two spots, Brock and Pilot Point, they're both 5-0, and they have clinched playoff spots. And you have 3 teams that are fighting for the other 2 spots, and these are 2 of them. Whitesboro is 4-4 overall and 3-2 in district play after they won 64-7 against Bowie. And Paradise is coming off a double overtime loss against Peaster, 41-38, and that was a huge swing game in this race because right now Peaster sits alone in 3rd place. They are 4-1, Whitesboro 3-2, and Paradise 2-3. So it's very obvious as to how things are going to play out because not only does Whitesboro play Paradise this week, they play Peaster next week, and Peaster this week is playing one of the big dogs that needs to win and keep pace at the top of the standings. They're going to play Brock, so you have to assume that they are going to lose that matchup, and so if they do, they'll drop to 4-2. So Whitesboro is looking to win this week, get to 4-2, tie Peaster, and then the winner of their game next week will be guaranteed the 3rd seed. The loser would get the 4 seed. A win this week would clinch a playoff spot for Whitesboro. It would also clinch a playoff spot for Peaster. Paradise would be eliminated. For those we have talked about it. Last year, Paradise won this game 20-12, and that ended up being the difference in Paradise making the playoffs and Whitesboro being left out on the head-to-head tiebreaker. They both tied for 4th place, and Whitesboro got left out. So there is a potential, depending on if Paradise wins going into that last game of the season, Whitesboro could end up in a 4-way tie, in a 3-way tie. And they don't want any part of that. They don't want a part of any ties. They just want to take care of business, and if they do that this week, they will. And they have to feel pretty good about the victory that they're coming off of. We mentioned 64-7 against a Bowie team that is at the bottom of the district standings, sitting with a 2-6 overall record, and they jumped right out. We're up 28-0 after the first quarter, and it was smooth sailing from there. The star of this game was Clay Hermes, playing quarterback in place of Mac Harper for this week. And he had a monster game. He had 5 touchdown passes and also ran for 2 scores. He was 13 of 18 passing for 236 yards and those 5 touchdowns. And he had 11 carries for 50 yards and 2 touchdowns as well. In order, Jay Sanders had the big game receiving, 3 catches for 99 yards and 2 touchdowns. Sean Shares had 3 catches for 68 yards and a touchdown. And Jake Hermes had 4 catches for 51 yards and 2 scores as well. And this was a game that obviously, like I said, was not close at all. Whitesboro did what they needed to do. They tied the school record for points. It's the 3rd time in school history that Whitesboro has scored has scored 64 points. So they were able to match that as well. And it has them feeling good, obviously, going into not just a key matchup this week. Obviously, they can take care of business and lock that up. But they have another big one next week as well. So exactly what you would want to see from Whitesboro so far this year in this district. Obviously, they've only lost to the top 2 teams, and they have themselves in position to get at least the 3rd seed, depending on how things go these last 2 games. They win these last 2, and they will be the 3rd seed for the playoffs. So we'll see if Whitesboro can, at the very least this week, lock in a playoff spot, make sure that's all taken care of going into the last game of the season when they host Paradise on Friday night. We shift over to 5-3A Division 1. We have a pair of games in this one. First, we'll talk about the Howe Bulldogs hosting Bonham. This is 0-8 Howe, 0-5 in district play after they lost last week 50-0 against Mineola. And then Bonham is also coming off a loss. They went up against Pottsboro and they came away on the wrong side of a 58-37 decision there. And this is a key game for Bonham because they are in the thick of a very spirited playoff chase. So Pottsboro, who we will talk about in a second, and Mount Vernon have both clinched playoff spots. Mineola is in third place at 3-2, and then you have Bonham, Winsboro, and Commerce are all tied at 2-3 in fourth place. So this is a huge game for Bonham, one to stay in that mix. Also because they finish with Emory Reigns. So you're playing the bottom two teams in the standings. You do have the tiebreaker over the two teams that you are tied with. So as long as you find a way to either stay even with them or get a slight advantage, Bonham could end up in the playoffs. So they certainly do not want to slip up. Of course, Howe trying to find that win. They've been close in some games. This was a game last year that came down to a field goal in the last seconds, and Bonham won 31-29. Howe's had some chances this year. Last week was not one of them. Mineola jumped out early, kept Howe off the scoreboard. Obviously, it was a little bit tougher for Howe because they had some guys out injured. Specifically in the backfield, Austin Haley didn't play. Carson Daniels, starting running back, didn't play. So that had guys shift around, try to make the best of it. But Mineola jumped up 34-0 at halftime, and they were able to kind of cruise from there and put up some big numbers. Put up some big numbers in that one. So, but I think this is a game that if you're Howe going into it, you feel you can at least compete with them. You did last year, and so you're at home. You got a couple games left. Why not? Why not us at this time in this game? Try to find a way to get a victory. Obviously, it would certainly depend on if some guys are able to come back healthy or not. But Howe's in a spot that this is one of those games that that they when they looked at the schedule, I'm sure they had a chance to get a win. And Bonham's put up a lot of points. That's been a calling card for them. They've also given up a lot of points. So there's that as well. So you have this could be a high scoring game. Bonham's played a lot of high scoring games in this district, and this week might be another one of those, depending on how things go and how healthy Howe can be going into the matchup after some guys were out last week. So we'll see if Howe can get off the schneid. And that losing streak that's now dating back to 2019, and when they host Bonham on Friday night in this 5-3A Division I matchup. The big game in this district and just overall, this is a big state game because Mount Vernon will be traveling to Pottsboro. You have 8-0 Mount Vernon, 5-0 in district. Pottsboro 5-2 overall, 5-0 in district. Both are coming off wins. Mount Vernon won last week 41-21 against Winsboro. And we mentioned, obviously, Pottsboro had the 58-37 victory against Bonham. This is a monster game for a lot of reasons. One, the winner is going to get the top seed for the playoffs, no matter what happens in the last week of the season. They are guaranteed to be the top seed. If you care about such things, they're guaranteed at least a share of the district title. And depending on how things finish, they could get it outright. And Mount Vernon is one of those. I think we mentioned it last week. They are one of those state ranked teams. And I think a lot of people, they have not really been tested. So I think there are some people who would like to see them potentially be tested, and this obviously is going to probably be I think obviously it's their best test in this district before they open the playoffs. They've put up a lot of points. They have not really been tested, and I'm interested to see what happens in this game. This is a game last year that Pottsboro won. So if you look at it from that perspective, I know the rosters have changed for both of these teams, but you at least go in knowing that we can potentially play with them. We beat them last year. This is the number 4 team in the state. That could overwhelm some people. But Pottsboro beat them on the field. It was a close game. So they not only did they win, they know they could play with them, and they know how good Mount Vernon is. And Pottsboro's been on a roll. We've talked about it every week since district started. They had those 2 losses. Obviously losing to Gunner is no shame. We'll talk about them here in a minute. But when you lose to a team like that, I don't think anybody's going to say anything bad about that, especially the way that that Gunner has just kind of been rolling. So that's understandable. The opening loss to Community still kind of doesn't make sense. I just think that's a team that was trying to figure some things out. And they had that 3-week gap because of the bye. And they were able to obviously figure things out because ever since they've come out of the bye in district play, they've been rolling. They're putting up points. A lot of the games have not been, none of the games have really been close. I think this game is probably one of the closer ones against Bonham. Winning was that 58-37, 20. That still was a 3-touchdown game. And that's probably their closest score. They've scored at least 45 points in every district game. They put it together at the exact right time they needed to, and they have a chance to lock up the top seed, which they didn't get last year because they tied Mineola and Mineola had won the tiebreaker against them. So this is a chance for them to finish a little bit higher in the seeding for sure. Get another piece of a district title. Like I said, they're just rolling right now, and you can see it in the way that they're playing. You look at last week, kind of pulled away in the second half after kind of a back and forth first half. But then you look up and they've got over 600 yards of offense. They have 365 on the ground, 273 through the air. Major McBride had 27 carries for 232 yards and 3 touchdowns. Jet Carroll, 12 of 22 passing for 273 yards and 3 touchdowns, and also ran 31 times for 133 yards and 2 scores. And then the 3 big targets, Reed Thompson, 6 catches for 177 yards and a score. Jake Kubik, 4 catches for 76 yards and a score. And Jude Bentley had a touchdown among his 2 catches as well. So there's a lot of firepower right now. They're feeling good, obviously. And that's what you want going into, obviously this huge game. And then, like we said, both those 2 have already clinched playoff spots. And no matter what happens, if the loser of this game ends up losing their last game, Mount Vernon plays Howe, Pottsboro plays Winsboro, and that could be a Winsboro team that has a lot to play for in that last game. The loser is guaranteed to be the 2nd seed because they would end up having the head-to-head tiebreaker against Mineola since they both beat Mineola earlier this year. So this is, like I said, this is for 1st or 2nd place. There is no in between. There's nothing. This is going to decide it, and then you'll know how that shakes out. You don't have to worry about looking at scoreboards next week or whatever. Whoever takes care of business this week knows that that's the case for sure. So we'll see. It's a big one for Pottsboro and Mount Vernon at Pottsboro in 5-3A Division I, and I think there's a lot of people that are around the state that are going to be interested to see about this score, just to kind of see, because Mount Vernon has been pretty dominant so far, and it's going to be interesting to see if Pottsboro has a say in that as we get ready for the playoffs in the coming weeks. We shift now over to District 8-3A Division II. We have 3 matchups this week as we welcome back Whitewright off their bye. And that's the big game in this district is Whitewright traveling to Bells. Whitewright 4-4 overall, 3-1 after not playing last week. And Bells is coming off a 34-7 victory against SNS. and they are 6-3 and 4-1 overall. The district standings in this one are starting to take shape. We mentioned obviously last week the Bells SNS game was going to play a big part of that, and it did. So you have Gunner is still in first place at 4-0. They have clinched a playoff spot. Bells has also clinched a playoff spot at 4-1. White right behind them 3-1. They will clinch with a victory. They will not clinch if they lose. And the reason for that is the SNS Leonard matchup that we will talk about keeps some scenarios still in play. So White Red is playing to clinch a playoff spot. Bells is looking to clinch the second seed, at least the second seed. They would need Gunner to lose out. Obviously, that is not something that you can really count on, but mathematically it is possible. But this is Bell's last game. They have the district bye next week, so they're looking to finish 7-3 overall and 5-1 in district play, and that 5-1 is likely going to guarantee them second seed for the second straight year. So there's a lot on the line for some people. Obviously, if Bells loses, there's a chance that White Right could sneak up there and get that second seed. So this is not sort of those we can just kind of play and see what happens type of a deal. And obviously, I would think since Bells is going to have 2 weeks off, you're going to want to play hard because you're going to have that week off next week. So and like I said, White Right has a chance to lock things up. They do not want to have a repeat of last year where they were going to go into the last game of the season. And luckily, the way things have been, especially the last month, 6 weeks or so, games are not being canceled because of COVID-19. The first 3 or 4 weeks, and probably because it was non-district play, there were a lot of games that got moved or canceled and opponents were being switched. That has definitely not been the case, but there are games. There's already been games. It's only a handful. It's not as many as it was last year. But there are still 1 or 2, maybe up to 5 games a week, and that's very small because there's 500 or whatever games a week that are getting played. So it's a very small number. But there are games occasionally getting canceled, and you don't want to have a situation when it's the last game of the season and it's the winner is in and the loser goes home. That you get left out because you don't get to play. That happened to White Right last year. I guarantee you they do not want to have that be the situation again, and they know what's at stake. They can take care of business this week. Bells took care of business last week to get to this point. Like I said, they won 34-7, and it was a relatively close game for 3 quarters. Even though SNS, they didn't score until the fourth quarter. Bells was only up 8-0 after the first quarter. It was 14-0 at halftime, and then it was 22-0 after 3 quarters. And Bells basically did what they did on the ground, racked up over 400 yards rushing. Leading the way was Bo Baker, 13 carries, 174 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Blake Rowland, 7 carries for 77 yards and 2 scores as well. Spencer Hines, 15 carries, 113 yards, and a touchdown, and that was the bulk of the action there. I don't say the interesting thing about Bells, but it shows just the depth and what they're able to do with that slot T offense. They have had a lot of guys in that backfield rotating in and out because of injuries and all that sort of stuff. The starting backfield in this game in week 9 was not the starting backfield that you would have expected based on the first couple of weeks or the preseason feeling. But they just keep plugging in guys and getting production. And 1 week it may be this guy, and 1 week it may be that guy, and they're just they're making it work, and that says a lot about the culture and a lot of times people talk about offensive line gets overlooked. If the holes are there, guys can run through them, and they're obviously doing a really good job up front to make sure that no matter who is in the lineup, who is getting the carries, they're getting the job done. And it also helps when your defense can hold somebody down, essentially almost get a shutout. SNS scored in the final minute So they were that close to getting a shutout, hold them to under 300 yards, force 3 turnovers. So Bells is in position, like we said, to lock up a top 2 seed at least, and then hopefully get healthy for the guys that may have some lingering things when they get ready for the playoffs, since they have the bye next week. And then White, like we said, they're coming off a bye. They've had moments this year where they've had guys banged up and just trying to survive, get healthy. That they rode that strong start in this district after opening with the loss to Gunner. They've beaten everybody else. They've got Leonard next week, and we'll talk about Leonard here in a second. So that's probably gonna be a crucial game for sure. But like I said, they can take care of their business this week if they find a way to win. Worst case scenario is they have to deal with some scoreboard watching next week. But if they win either this week or next week, they'll be in. They just need one more win. But of course, you don't want to have it come down to the last week. You want to lock in that spot, and they'd be able to do that with a win this week. Speaking of Leonard and speaking of SNS, that's the next game in this district we'll talk about. SNS is going to travel to Leonard. This is 2-6 overall and 2-2 in district play. SNS after the loss last week to Bells, while Leonard comes in at 5-2 and 2-2 in district play. They won against Lone Oak 50-14, and this is a huge swing game in this district. The winner will be guaranteed a playoff spot if White does win. So there's going to be a little bit of scoreboard watching there. If White loses, the winner cannot clinch. It will be dependent on what happens in the last week of the season. I won't go into that because there's a lot of potential scenarios there. But the winner will be in a very good spot going into the final game of the regular season. Of course, Leonard, is playing well. Their only losses are to the top 2 teams. They've lost to Gunner and they've lost to Bells. And then the question is, can they find a way to beat everybody else? And they're playing the 2 teams that are right in front of them or tied with. They play SNS, who they're tied with this week. They'll play White, who will either be in front of them or tied with them if they win this week in the finale. So it's right there for Leonard. And I think this last year this game was 41-40. Crazy game coming down to the end. SNS was able to pull it out. I'm sure Leonard wants to get some revenge. This is on their home field, and like I said, this is a huge game, not just for seeding, but for the playoffs. And these are 2 teams that made the playoffs last year. SNS was the 3rd seed. Leonard was the 4th seed. And I think they both won their first round games as lower seeds. So I think this is a situation where somebody's going to get left out of this group. For the second straight year, this White SNS Leonard trio. Lone Oak and Blue Ridge are out of the picture, so it's 3 teams for 2 spots, and they're all basically more or less playing each other in some permutation over the next 2 weeks. So it's going to come down to the last week like it did last year. I don't think that's probably a surprise to anybody. And so we'll see what happens with SNS going to Leonard. They're going to have to find a little bit more offense. They're coming off a game, obviously, almost got shut out. Things did not go totally well. They had some moments. Like I said, you're down 14-0 at halftime. They couldn't really put together things. They had some big plays at times. Colton Corville had 3 catches for 70 yards. Coda Richardson threw for 114 yards. Ran for 87 on 22 carries. Chase Sloan actually had the touchdown run, a little 2-yard punched it in there in the final minute, but they're gonna need to get a little more firepower against Leonard. Leonard scored at least 39 points in every game that they've won, so if they can put up points, and they have in all the games that they've won. So gonna be an interesting matchup, and I'm sure everybody's gonna be looking, none bigger than White to see what happens in this game to determine the playoff fates for the final teams in this district to see if they get in. And then, of course, the last game in this district, the Gunner Tigers, looking to lock up things at the top of the district standings. They are hosting Lone Oak. Gunner is 8-0, and 4-0 in district play. Lone Oak is 2-6 overall and 0-4. Like we mentioned, they're coming off the loss to Leonard, and Gunner is coming off a 49-14 win against Blue Ridge. This was a game last year that was not close. A lot of Gunner's games this year have not been close. The Tigers continued their streak of not allowing a first, or not. It's not really a streak because Leonard scored against them in the first half, but they again did not allow a first half point. They have not allowed a first half point in 6 of their 8 games, and defensively they've only given up 1 touchdown in the first half of their games. They've just been rolling along. They will clinch the top seed with a win. They will clinch at least a share of the district title with a win, and they will obviously look to finish that off next week. Lone Oak has been eliminated. There's no way that they can do anything playoff-wise, sitting at 0-4, no matter what happens in the other games. And like we said, Gunner just keeps rolling along. In this game, they were up 42-0 at halftime. Blue Ridge scored twice in the third quarter, but that was the extent of it. Defensively, they held Blue Ridge to barely 100 yards. They finished with 116, forced 3 turnovers, and then offensively, spread out again. Just that's what Gunner does, and much like what Bells has kind of been dealing with. Gunner's had some injuries. They've had guys in and out of the lineup. But they've been able to obviously spread the wealth, which is something they normally do anyway. Ethan Sloan, this is kind of how crazy this game was. Ethan Sloan had 3 carries for 137 yards and 2 touchdowns. Hudson Graham was 8 of 8 passing for 133 yards and 2 scores. Just looking at some of the other numbers, Cole Lemons had a touchdown catch. Cooper Wade had the other touchdown catch. Trey Walton returned one of the turnovers, a fumble for a touchdown. And then you throw in, guys who hadn't really contributed, at least in the backfield in the running game. But Braden Hinton has a touchdown run. Logan Pierce has a touchdown run. And like I said, it's basically game over at halftime. Up 42-0. And so Gunner's gonna we'll take care. They've got Lone Oak, who should not be a whole lot of trouble, and then they'll have SNS to finish, and that may be a game that SNS has to win to potentially get into the playoffs. Obviously, we'll know more about that this week, but like I said, Gunner just keeps on rolling on. I hate to say there's not a whole lot to say because they're just so good. They're so balanced. They're so they are playing like the number 2 team in the state. I don't know how they're not number 1. When you're on the run that they've been on and you get as far as you did last year, making the state semifinals, and you lose to the eventual champion, and you bring back all the kids that they have brought back, and they're demolishing people in a way that I think, I know rankings don't matter, but you kind of look at stuff like that and you go, how does a team that is doing what it's doing, winning by an average score of, like, what is that, 48-8, how is that not, number 1 worthy based on your history and all the kids that you brought back? But they're playing for bigger things, and we'll see what they do against Lone Oak. I think we have a pretty good idea what they're going to do against Lone Oak when they play on Friday in 8-3A Division II action. A couple more games here. We head down to 2A. Here's another big game. Big playoff implications here in 5-2A Division I as Tom Bean travels to Tioga. Tom Bean is 0-7 and 0-3, and Tioga is 4-4 and 2-1. And you say, why is this a big matchup? And the reason this is a big matchup is on the Tioga side. The way this district is starting to shape out, there's a chance all the playoff spots could be clinched after this week, and Tioga is a big piece of that. If they win, they will clinch a playoff spot. They are currently tied with Lindsay at 2-1 behind Alvord, who is 3-0. And then Collinsville and Trenton are 1-2, and Tom Bean is hanging around at 0-3. If Tom Bean loses, that will eliminate them from the playoffs. So obviously that's key. This is a must-win for them. And if Tioga wins, and we'll talk about this when we get to Collinsville, but I'll throw it out here. If Tioga wins, and Collinsville wins against Trenton, and Lindsay wins against Alvord, the playoff field is set. It will be Alvord, Tioga, Lindsay, and Collinsville. And so we know who those four are. And then the question will come down to seeding. And if you're Tioga, you want to lock in, obviously, for a team that didn't make the playoffs last year. Obviously, is playing a lot better. They're coming off a 23-13 win against Collinsville. You got a chance to not only make the playoffs, but get a better seed. That's a huge deal for the Bulldogs. And they won last week. We talked about how key that game was. They were able to hold on. They were up 23-0 after 3 quarters. Collinsville scored a couple touchdowns in the latter half of the fourth quarter to make it interesting. But Tioga was able to get the win. They did it by getting all 312 yards on the ground. Leading the way was Logan Westbrook. He had 24 carries for 192 yards and scored all 3 touchdowns. Alex Catarino made a field goal to mix in there, and they were able to hold off that late push by Collinsville. So they have right now, they would be the 3rd seed because they don't have the tiebreaker with Lindsay, depending on how things were to shake out, and they still have to play. They still have to play Trenton at the end. So, I'm sorry, they have to play Alvord. So, if you win this week, if you're Tioga, and either Lindsay or if Alvord stays undefeated, you're playing for a district championship the next week. And even if Lindsay does beat Alvord and you win, you have a 3-way tie for first place. And if you win, you would get at least a share of the district title. You may not get the top seed. Lindsay may still get that, but that'd be a huge improvement for Tioga. And we mentioned Tom Bean. They're coming off a 55-0 loss against Lindsay. Again, we've talked about it all year with Tom Bean. They've really been struggling to put things together offensively. They have not started 0-8 since 2006. So they're trying just to find some positive momentum here towards the end of a season that hasn't gone well. They have Tioga this week. They have Collinsville next week. Collinsville may be in a situation where they need to win next week, which is what it was last year, except Tom Bean was in the mix for that playoff spot. So we'll see what happens. Like I said, Tom Bean's got nothing. They got nothing to lose. They got everything to play for. They have to win to try to stay in the race. And Tioga obviously is looking to lock in at least a playoff spot, which they can do with a win. And that would be a big step in the first year under Chad Rogers. It would be their first non-losing regular season since they moved up in 2018 to the 11-man ranks. And if they get that 5th win, that they won 5 games the previous 3 years combined, and they'll be sitting at 5-4 and a chance to get a winning record going into that last game at 6-4 for the regular season. So will be interesting to see how things shake out in that one as Tioga hosts Tom Bean. And then the other local matchup in that district, Collinsville will be hosting Trenton. And this is a key matchup as well because, like we mentioned, we're talking about the standings. You have Collinsville and Trenton are both tied at 1-2 and in 4th place. Excuse me. And then the winner, like I said, Collinsville needs a couple things to happen for it to clinch. But either way, the winner is in a really good spot, and the loser is going to need some help. They'll be doing a lot of scoreboard watching the last week to get some help that they need. Trenton comes in at 4-3 and 1-2. Collinsville is 3-5 and 1-2. We mentioned obviously Collinsville, the loss to Tioga 23-13, and Trenton lost against Alvord 51-17. So we mentioned last week. So Collinsville, they had the 2 touchdowns late. Logan Jenkins threw for 182 yards and 2 touchdowns, but also had 3 interceptions. He also had 10 carries for 62 yards. Parker Wells led the Pirates rushing 18 carries for 77 yards. Nathan Bocanegra had 3 catches for 74 yards and a touchdown. And Colin Barnes had the other touchdown. He finished with 5 catches for 43 yards. Carter Scott had 4 for 41. But for 3 quarters, Collinsville really couldn't get anything going. Tioga was able to kind of control things with that ground attack, running 55 times for 312 yards. And it was kind of a bit of too little too late for Collinsville in that one. And this is a game, it was key last year. Because it was kind of not, I don't know, it might have been in the exact same spot actually in the standings where they were in 4th place. I think they were tied for 3rd last year, if my memory is serving me correctly. Now that I think about it, and Collinsville won that game 31-9. That kind of locked them into the 3rd seed. They're going to need some help to get the 3rd seed this year because they have not. They have a win over Lindsay, but they've lost to Tioga and Alvord. So, but at this point, you just want to get that win. And like I said, if the path for Collinsville to go into the last game knowing that they're in is Collinsville wins, Tioga wins, and Lindsay wins. So if you're a Pirates fan, you want Tioga to beat Tom Bean, and you want Lindsay to beat Alvord. If those 2 things happen and you take care of business against Trenton, you have locked in your playoff spot for sure. The only question is what seed are you going to be. So that's how things shake up. Trenton I don't think they have to win, but they're going to be in a world of hurt. They need some people. They would need a lot of help if they were to lose this game. They would need the help this week and next week, and I don't know if they're going to get it. They will play Lindsay next week, so that's why they may not be completely out of it. But they would be in if they don't win this week, it's obviously a must win for them next week. They don't want to get it to that point, so they're going to do everything they can to try to come away with a victory when Collinsville hosts them on Friday night. In the last game, down in the TAPS 6-man ranks, we have the Texoma Christian Eagles. They will be hosting Dallas Fairhill. Both teams searching for their first win, not only in district play, that's Division III, District 2 play, but also overall in the season. TCS is 0-8, and Dallas Fairhill is 0-7. Last year, TCS won this game 84-33. That was the only win for Texoma Christian last year. Fairhill did not win a game last year. I'm sorry. They didn't win a district game last year. They're on an 11-game losing streak dating back to last year. And of course, both teams did make the playoffs last year. They had the wacky COVID bracket where everybody got to play, and even with that, Dallas Fairhill ended up having to forfeit because they couldn't play because of COVID. So that was just one of those crazy years. TCS coming off a 58-0 loss against district co-leader Covenant Classical, and Fairhill lost the other district co-leader 54-8 against Irving Faustina. Someone is going to be happy Friday night when this game takes place. Both teams are out of the playoff race. So this is, like we said, with some of the other teams in the area, just a chance to get some positive momentum, have a good feeling here towards the end of the season, and as we kind of look together, as we look towards the next year for both of these teams. But like I said, you really hope TCS can get a win here, get that positive feeling. That's at home, playing a team that they beat last year. So hopefully good things will happen for TCS when they host Dallas Fairhill in TAPS 6-man action on Friday night. So that is where we are. Again, it should be really interesting to see what happens. There's so many games that mean so much for the respective districts. But that's what you expect this time of year. A lot of key games, a lot of people rooting for this team over that team, needing some help. And we could be in a situation where a lot of things are locked in going into next week. And we will talk about that next week after we see what happens here in Week 10. Enjoy your week as always. Enjoy your time out there. Be safe. I guess the weather's going to be crazy again this week. I don't think we've had a consistency on that all season, so why not have one more weekend of that in October. It is Halloween weekend, so there's that. So there's that added safety to that. So have fun, but not too much fun. And we will talk to you next week. As always, thanks for tuning in. We got a couple more weeks. We'll do a podcast for those unfamiliar through the last team in the playoffs. It may not be as long, though. Obviously, as teams get eliminated, we will have less to talk about. But that's what makes it fun. But it looks like we're going to have a really good representation in the playoffs, just based on the way things are looking right now. Some of the teams that have already clinched, and that'll make for a fun November, and hopefully we'll get some of those teams into December as well. So again, thanks for tuning in. Enjoy your Week 10 games, and we'll talk to you next week.